Understanding the context, entertainment, and hierarchy. Before we tell you about the night that changed Dean Martin forever, we need to understand something important about how entertainment venues and events were run in the 1960s and 1970s. During this era, there was a very clear hierarchy at concert halls, nightclubs, and entertainment venues. At the top were the wealthy people, the people who had money, who could afford expensive tickets, who had connections and power. These were the people who mattered. These were the people who got the best seats, the best service, the best treatment. At the bottom were the poor people, the homeless people, the people with nothing. These people were often not welcome at entertainment venues at all. And if they somehow managed to get in, they were treated with contempt. They were moved along. They were told to leave. They were made to feel that they didn't belong. Security staff at these venues were there to maintain this hierarchy. Their job was to make sure that people who didn't belong were removed. Their job was to protect the wealthy and powerful from the presence of the poor and powerless. This was considered normal. This was considered acceptable. This was considered just the way things were. But not everyone accepted this way of thinking. Some people like Dean Martin, understood that this hierarchy was wrong. And Dean Martin was about to prove that he was willing to stop everything, risk his career, and stand up for someone who had nothing. The performance Dean Martin was performing at one of the most prestigious nightclubs in the country. It was a packed house. Wealthy people, important people, people who had paid good money to see the great Dean Martin perform. The show was going perfectly. Dean Martin was in his element. He was singing. He was joking. He was making the audience laugh and cry. He was doing what he did best, entertaining people, making them forget their problems for a few hours, making them feel alive. Then Dean Martin saw something that made him stop. An elderly man was being pulled away by security. The man was struggling. He was trying to stay. Security was grabbing his arm. They were forcing him out of the room. The man wasn't being loud. He wasn't being disruptive. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just sitting there watching the show. But apparently he didn't belong. Apparently, his presence was not welcome. And that's when Dean Martin did something that nobody expected. He stopped his performance. In the middle of a song. In the middle of entertaining hundreds of wealthy, important people. Dean Martin stopped everything and called out security. "Wait," Dean Martin said. "Stop. Let that man go." Everyone in the audience turned around. Everyone saw the elderly man. Everyone saw the security guards with their hands on his arm. And everything changed. Why this hook works. The audience immediately feels the tension. A performer stops his show to defend someone being removed by security. There's an immediate sense that this is going to be controversial. It makes people want to know more. It makes them wonder why Dean Martin would do this. It makes them wonder who the elderly man is and what happens next. Dean Martin, the entertainer at the top. Dean Martin in the 1960s and 1970s was at the absolute peak of his fame. He had it all. He was rich. He was famous. He was beloved. He was one of the biggest entertainment stars in the world. Dean Martin had spent decades building his career. He had sung. He had acted in movies. He had performed in nightclubs. He had built an empire of entertainment. He was wealthy beyond most people's wildest dreams. But more than that, Dean Martin had something else. He had a platform. He had influence. He had the ability to say something and have people listen. When Dean Martin spoke, people paid attention. By the 1960s, Dean Martin had also become known for something else. For his humanity. For his kindness. For his willingness to stand up for people who were being treated unfairly. We've already told you the story of how Dean Martin stood by his friend Sammy Davis Jr. when others didn't. We've told you the story of how Dean Martin turned down the president's inauguration to be there for his son. We've told you the story of how Dean Martin used his platform to help people. So when Dean Martin stopped his performance to defend an elderly man being removed by security, it wasn't completely out of character. It was actually very much in character. It was consistent with who Dean Martin had always been. But it was still shocking, because even with his history of kindness, even with his history of standing up for people, nobody expected him to stop a performance in the middle of a show. Nobody expected him to risk the anger of the wealthy, powerful people who had paid to see him perform. The elderly man. A life of hardship. The elderly man was named Frank. He was in his 70s. He had lived a hard life. Frank had worked most of his adult life doing manual labor, construction work, landscaping, that kind of work. He had made just enough money to get by, but not enough to save for retirement. He had never married. He had no family to help him. He had spent his entire life working just to survive. By the time he reached his 70s, Frank was poor. Genuinely poor. He didn't have much money. He lived in a small apartment. He struggled to pay his bills. But Frank had one thing that nobody could take away from him. He loved music. He loved entertainment. He loved the way that a great performer like Dean Martin could make him forget his troubles, even if just for a few hours. Frank had saved up for weeks. He had scrimped and saved every penny. He had gone without so that he could afford a ticket to see Dean Martin perform. For Frank, this was a huge deal. This was not something he did very often. This was a special occasion. Frank had gotten dressed up in his best clothes. He had come to the nightclub with such excitement and joy. For a few hours, he was going to be part of the glamorous world of entertainment. For a few hours, he was going to feel like he mattered. But then he was told to leave. The venue and the security. The nightclub was exclusive. It was expensive. It was the kind of place where wealthy people came to be entertained and to feel important. The management of the nightclub had made it clear to security. Keep out the riffraff. Keep out the poor people. Keep out anyone who doesn't look like they belong. Make sure that the wealthy, important people don't have to look at poverty or struggle. In other words, get rid of people like Frank. When Frank walked in, he was visibly out of place. His clothes weren't expensive. He didn't have the polish and grooming of the wealthy people around him. One look at him, and the management knew. This was someone who didn't belong. So when the show started, when Dean Martin began his performance, the management told security to remove Frank. Quietly, discreetly, so that the wealthy people wouldn't have to see it happening. Security grabbed Frank's arm and started pulling him toward the door. Why this section matters. Now the audience understands the contrast. Dean Martin is at the top of the entertainment world, rich and famous and powerful. Frank is at the bottom, poor and powerless and invisible. The management has decided that Frank doesn't belong. And that's when everything changed. The moment Dean Martin noticed Dean Martin was in the middle of a song. He was performing for hundreds of people. The audience was rapt. They were hanging on every word, every note. But Dean Martin was also watching the crowd. Good performers do that. They watch the audience. They read the room. They understand the energy. And that's when Dean Martin saw it. He saw the elderly man being pulled away by security. He saw the man struggling. He saw the man's face, a face filled with confusion and sadness. A face that said, "Why am I being treated this way? I paid for my ticket. I just want to listen to music." Something shifted inside Dean Martin in that moment. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't pretend he didn't see it. He couldn't keep singing as if it wasn't happening. So he stopped. The confrontation. Dean Martin walked to the edge of the stage. He looked directly at security. He looked directly at the man being pulled away. "Let him go," Dean Martin said. Security froze. They didn't know what to do. They weren't used to being contradicted, especially not by the performer they were supposed to be protecting. "Let him go," Dean Martin said again. Now, the security guards looked at each other. Then they looked at the management. The management looked confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. The performer wasn't supposed to care about who was being removed. But Dean Martin was serious. He was waiting. He was not going to perform again until the elderly man was allowed to stay. So the security guards let Frank go. The weight of the decision in that moment, Dean Martin had made a choice. He had chosen the elderly man over the wealthy people who had paid to see him perform. He had chosen principle over profit. He had chosen to stand up for someone who had nothing. But Dean Martin understood the potential consequences of his decision. He understood that the management might be angry. He understood that wealthy, powerful people might be offended. He understood that this could affect his career. He understood that there could be repercussions. But he also understood that it was the right thing to do. He understood that an elderly man who had saved for weeks to see his show should not be treated like garbage. He understood that everyone, no matter how poor, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. So he stood by his decision. The rest of the performance, after Dean Martin made it clear that Frank would be allowed to stay, he went back to the stage. He finished his performance. But the performance was different now. It was more meaningful. It was charged with something real. The audience understood what had just happened. They understood that Dean Martin had just made a statement about what he believed in. Some of the wealthy people in the audience were angry. Some of them felt like they had been rebuked, as if Dean Martin was saying that they were bad people for accepting this situation. But some of them were moved. Some of them understood what Dean Martin had done. Some of them felt ashamed that they had been okay with an elderly man being removed. Frank watched the rest of the performance with tears in his eyes. He wasn't crying because of sadness. He was crying because someone had seen him. Someone had cared. Someone had stood up for him. The conversation after the performance was over, after the show ended, Dean Martin did something that showed his true character. He had Frank brought backstage. He wanted to talk to him. He wanted to know who this man was. He wanted to hear his story. Frank told Dean Martin about his life. He told him about the years of hard work. He told him about living paycheck to paycheck. He told him about saving for weeks to afford a ticket to this show. He told him about how much it meant to him. And Dean Martin listened. He really listened. He didn't make it about himself. He didn't make it about what a good person he was for standing up to security. He just listened to Frank's story. Then Dean Martin did something that Frank could never have imagined. He asked Frank what his favorite song was. And Dean Martin sang that song for him. Just for him. In a private room backstage, with nobody watching, Dean Martin performed a song for an elderly man who had nothing. Frank cried. He cried harder than he had ever cried in his life. The weight of meaning. In that moment, Frank felt something that he had rarely felt in his life. He felt valued. He felt like he mattered. He felt like his life, his struggle, his existence, it all meant something. And Dean Martin felt something too. He felt the weight of what it meant to use his platform for good. He felt the responsibility that came with having power and privilege. The news spreads. Word of what Dean Martin had done spread quickly. In the age of telephone gossip, word traveled fast through Hollywood and beyond. Some people criticized Dean Martin. They said he was being unprofessional. They said he had no right to interfere with security. They said he had embarrassed the management and the wealthy patrons of the nightclub. But many more people supported him. Other entertainers heard about what he had done and were inspired. Fans heard about what he had done and loved him even more. Regular people heard about what he had done and understood that here was someone who actually cared about other people. The venue's response to the management of the nightclub was angry at first. They felt like Dean Martin had undermined their authority. They felt like he had embarrassed them in front of their wealthy patrons. But they also understood something. Dean Martin was a huge draw. People wanted to see him perform. If they fired him or banned him, they would lose money. More than that, they understood the public relations implications. If they punished Dean Martin for defending an elderly man who was being mistreated, it would make them look bad. It would look like they didn't care about treating poor people with dignity. So eventually, the management backed down. They didn't apologize to Dean Martin, but they also didn't punish him. The changed venue over time, the nightclub's practices changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. They started being more welcoming to people of all economic backgrounds. They understood, because of Dean Martin's actions, that this was how people should be treated. Other nightclubs and entertainment venues heard about what had happened. Some of them were inspired to change their practices too. Some of them understood that excluding poor people wasn't acceptable. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a shift. It was a change in how people thought about who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The impact on Dean Martin's career. Contrary to what Dean Martin might have feared, his career didn't suffer because of his actions. If anything, it got better. People respected him more. They understood that here was someone who actually stood for something. Someone who was willing to risk something for his principles. Someone who was willing to use his platform for good. Other performers saw Dean Martin's example and were inspired to do the same thing. They understood that you could stand up for what was right without destroying your career. You could actually build your career by doing the right thing. Frank's life changed for Frank. The encounter with Dean Martin changed his life. Not in dramatic ways. He didn't suddenly become rich. He didn't suddenly become famous. But something changed in how he saw himself. Frank realized that he mattered. He realized that he was worthy of dignity and respect. He realized that even though he didn't have much money, even though he didn't have power or influence, he was still a human being who deserved to be treated well. Frank lived for several more years after that night. And he told everyone about it. He told everyone about how Dean Martin had stood up for him. He told everyone about how a famous entertainer had shown him kindness when he had expected nothing. And by telling that story, Frank reminded other people about what was important. He reminded them that kindness matters. That standing up for people who have nothing matters. That one moment of compassion can change someone's life. What this story really teaches us. The story of Dean Martin stopping his performance to defend an elderly man is ultimately a story about what really matters. It's a story about the difference between performing for people and actually caring about people. It's a story about the difference between being successful and being good. The lesson about seeing people. One of the most important lessons from this story is about seeing people. Frank was being removed from the nightclub, and most people in the audience didn't notice. Most people were too focused on the performance, on the entertainment, on enjoying themselves. But Dean Martin noticed. He paid attention. He saw what was happening. In our world, there are so many Franks. There are so many people who are struggling, who are being treated poorly, who are being made to feel like they don't matter. And most of us don't notice. We're too busy with our own lives. Dean Martin's story teaches us that we need to pay attention. We need to look around. We need to notice when someone is being mistreated. We need to see people who are invisible. The lesson about speaking up. Dean Martin could have stayed quiet. He could have ignored what was happening. He could have finished his performance and moved on with his life. But he didn't. He spoke up. He used his voice. He used his platform. This teaches us something important about responsibility. When we see something wrong, we have a responsibility to say something. It doesn't matter if it's uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if it might make us unpopular. When we see injustice, we should speak up. The lesson about courage. It took courage for Dean Martin to do what he did. He didn't know how the audience would react. He didn't know how the management would react. He didn't know if his actions would damage his career. But he did it anyway. He had the courage to stand up for what he believed in, even though it was risky. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing even though you're afraid. Dean Martin had that kind of courage. The lesson about using your power for good. Dean Martin had power. He had influence. He had a platform. And he chose to use it to help someone who had nothing. This teaches us something important about privilege. Having privilege or power is not bad in itself. What matters is what you do with it. Do you use it to help yourself and ignore others? Or do you use it to help people who are struggling? Dean Martin chose to use his power to help Frank. And in doing so, he showed what real greatness looks like. The lesson about human dignity. At the heart of this story is a simple truth. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Rich people don't deserve it more than poor people. Famous people don't deserve it more than unknown people. Powerful people don't deserve it more than powerless people. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Everyone deserves to be seen as a human being. Everyone deserves to be valued. Dean Martin understood this. He understood that Frank, even though he had nothing, deserved to be treated with respect. He understood that Frank's life mattered. He understood that Frank's presence at the show was valuable. The question for you. This story asks each of us several questions. Do you see people who are invisible? Do you notice when someone is being treated poorly? Do you pay attention? When you see injustice, do you speak up? Or do you stay quiet to avoid making waves? Do you use whatever power or influence you have to help people who are struggling? Do you treat everyone with dignity and respect? Or do you treat some people as less valuable than others? These are hard questions. They don't have easy answers. But they're important questions. They're the questions that define who we really are. The eternal truth. The story of Dean Martin and Frank reminds us of something that we often forget. What really matters is not how much money you have, how famous you are, or how much power you have. What really matters is how you treat people. What really matters is whether you see people. What really matters is whether you stand up for what's right. Dean Martin had all the money and fame and power in the world. But what made him truly great was not any of those things. What made him truly great was his willingness to stop everything and stand up for an elderly man who had nothing. That's real greatness. That's what we should all strive for. The broader impact. How one act of kindness changed the world. What happened that night at the nightclub was small in some ways. Dean Martin stopped a performance. An elderly man was allowed to stay. That was all. But in other ways, it was huge. Because it sent a message. It told the world that there were people who cared about dignity. There were people who would stand up for what was right. There were people who understood that everyone mattered. The ripple effect through time. The story of Dean Martin and Frank spread far and wide. Other people heard about it. Other people were inspired by it. Other people understood that they too could stand up for what was right. Frank, in his remaining years, told everyone about how Dean Martin had helped him. And each time he told the story, it inspired someone. It reminded someone about what was important. It encouraged someone to be kinder, to be more compassionate, to see people who were invisible. The change in culture. Over time, because of stories like this one, attitudes changed. People became more aware of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. People became more willing to stand up for what was right, even if it was uncomfortable. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't a revolution. But it was real. And it started with one person, Dean Martin, who was willing to stop everything and stand up for someone who had nothing. Fire the modern relevance. In 2025, in our modern world, we still have the same dynamic. We still have wealthy people and poor people. We still have powerful people and powerless people. We still have people who are treated as if they matter more than others. The story of Dean Martin and Frank teaches us that this should change. That everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That we should all be willing to stand up for people who are being mistreated. The challenge. In 2025, we need more Dean Martins. We need more people who are willing to stop what they're doing and speak up when they see injustice. We need more people who are willing to use their platform to help people who are struggling. We need more people who understand that everyone matters. Maybe you're not a famous entertainer, but you have a voice. You have influence in some area of your life. You have the ability to stand up for what's right. How will you use that ability? Will you stay silent when you see injustice? Or will you speak up? That's the challenge that the story of Dean Martin and Frank leaves us with. Final call to action. If this story moved you, if it reminded you about what really matters, if it inspired you to stand up for people who are being treated unfairly, then smash that like button right now. And subscribe. Turn on the notification bell. This channel is dedicated to stories about real people who do the right thing, who stand up for others, who understand that everyone deserves dignity and respect. There are more incredible stories coming that will inspire you to be better, to care more, to speak up. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone who was being treated poorly? Have you ever noticed someone being mistreated and done something about it? Have you ever seen an act of kindness that reminded you what humanity is capable of? Or maybe you are someone who has been helped by an unexpected act of kindness. Maybe someone stood up for you when you had nothing. Maybe someone saw you and valued you when you felt invisible. If so, we want to hear your story. We want to honor that person. We want to make sure that their kindness is remembered. Share your story in the comments. Tell us about a moment when someone showed you compassion. Tell us about a time when you stood up for someone else. Tell us about the people who have shown you what humanity really looks like, because the world needs these stories. The world needs to remember that kindness exists. The world needs to understand that one person can make a difference. The world needs to know that everyone, even people with nothing, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. If you are someone who is struggling, someone who feels invisible, someone who feels like you don't matter, we want you to know you matter. Your life has value. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. You deserve to be seen. And there are people like Dean Martin who understand this, who care about this, who will stand up for you. Asterisk asterisk. Thank you for watching this beautiful story about Dean Martin and Frank. Thank you for understanding that what really matters is not money or fame or power, but how we treat each other. Thank you for caring about dignity and respect. Subscribe now and join a community of people who believe that everyone matters, that kindness is important, and that one person can change the world. Don't forget to share this story with someone you know. Maybe it will inspire them to stand up for someone who is being mistreated. Maybe it will remind them that everyone deserves kindness. Maybe it will change them the way Dean Martin changed Frank. See you in our next video. And remember, you have the power to see people. You have the power to stand up for what's right. You have the power to change someone's life through one act of kindness. The world is waiting for you to be Dean Martin. Will you answer?